The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in courtroom 3B as the morning docket dragged on. Judge Patricia Williams had seen it all in her 15 years on the bench: petty theft, domestic disputes, drunk and disorderly conduct. Another mundane Tuesday in municipal court, where society's forgotten faces cycled through the system like ghosts seeking warmth. The bailiff called the next case. Number 47C, State vs. Thomas Mitchell. Charges of loitering, trespassing, and disturbing the peace. An elderly man shuffled forward from the back bench, his movements careful and measured. His clothes told a story of hardship: a faded military field jacket 2 sizes too large, worn jeans with patches at the knees, and boots that had walked countless miles on unforgiving pavement. Despite his circumstances, something in his posture remained unbroken. He kept his shoulders square, his back straight, carrying himself with a dignity that poverty couldn't steal. "Please state your name for the record," requested the court clerk, not bothering to look up from her computer screen. The man cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the nearly empty courtroom with unexpected strength. "Thomas Joseph Mitchell, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment." Judge Williams' head snapped up from the case file she'd been reviewing. Her pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the wooden bench. The color drained from her face as she stared at the defendant before her. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the courtroom fell into complete silence. The prosecutor, a young man named David Chin, fresh out of law school and eager to make his mark, shifted uncomfortably. He'd never seen Judge Williams react this way to a simple name. The bailiff noticed too, his hand instinctively moving closer to his radio. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over her stenograph machine. "Did you say Mitchell?" Judge Williams asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas Mitchell?" "Yes, Your Honor," the veteran replied, confusion flickering across his weathered features. "Is there a problem?" Before we see how this incredible story unfolds, if you believe our veterans deserve better treatment, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think should happen to those who served our country. Now, back to what happened in that courtroom. Judge Williams composed herself with visible effort, straightening her black robe and retrieving her pen. But those who knew her well would notice the slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept glancing at the defendant as if seeing a ghost. "Please proceed, Mr. Chin," she said, though her voice lacked its usual authority. The prosecutor stood, consulting his notes with the confidence of someone who'd handled dozens of similar cases. "Your Honor, this is Mr. Mitchell's 4th appearance before this court in the past 6 months. The defendant has repeatedly been found loitering behind various downtown businesses, specifically near heating vents and dumpsters. On December 3rd, he was discovered by security guards at 2:47 a.m. behind Martinez Restaurant, where he had constructed what witnesses described as a makeshift shelter using cardboard and discarded tarps. Thomas Mitchell stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back in a military rest position. He didn't interrupt, didn't make excuses. He simply listened with the patience of a man who'd learned that some battles couldn't be won with words. "The business owners are concerned about health code violations and the impact on their customers," Chin continued. "Mr. Mitchell was warned twice by police and given information about local shelters, but he continues to return to these locations." Judge Williams forced herself to focus on the proceedings, though her mind raced with memories she'd tried to bury for over 2 decades. "Mr. Mitchell, do you have legal representation?" "No, Your Honor. I was assigned a public defender, but she had an emergency in another courtroom." His voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd spent too many cold nights outdoors, but underneath it was the unmistakable cadence of military bearing. "Would you like to request a continuance to secure counsel?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "I don't see much point in that, ma'am. The facts are what they are. I was where they said I was, doing what they said I was doing. I'm not going to waste the court's time pretending otherwise." The honesty in his response hit the courtroom like a physical force. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily taken aback by such straightforward admission. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Williams said carefully, "before we proceed, I'd like to understand your current living situation. You mentioned you're a veteran. When did you serve?" 3 tours, Your Honor. Iraq from 2003 to 2004, Afghanistan from 2006 to 2007, and again from 2009 to 2010. I was with the 75th Ranger Regiment, 2nd Battalion. Judge Williams gripped the edge of her bench. The 75th Rangers. 2nd Battalion. The details matched perfectly with the stories she'd heard so many years ago, stories that had shaped the trajectory of her entire adult life. "And your current housing situation," she pressed, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Thomas Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've been staying at the downtown Mission when there's space available, Your Honor. Winter months, that's not very often. Capacity is limited, and there are a lot of folks who need a warm place to sleep. So on the nights when the shelter is full, I make do, ma'am. I find someplace safe and try not to bother anybody." The simplicity of his words carried more weight than any dramatic plea could have. This was a man reduced to the most basic human need, survival, yet he spoke of it without self-pity or anger. Prosecutor Chen, perhaps sensing the shifting mood in the courtroom, pressed forward with his case. "Your Honor, while we certainly respect Mr. Mitchell's service to our country, the law applies equally to all citizens. The defendant has been repeatedly warned about his behavior. Business owners have the right to operate without finding makeshift campsites behind their establishments. What exactly was Mr. Mitchell doing when he was arrested?" Judge Williams asked. Chin consulted his notes. According to the arresting officer's report, he was sleeping in a cardboard shelter he'd constructed behind Martinez Restaurant. When approached by Officer Rodriguez at approximately 2:47 a.m., the defendant was cooperative but refused to dismantle the shelter until morning. "Did he cause any disturbance? Any damage to property?" "Well, no, Your Honor, but..." "Did he threaten anyone? Leave any trash or debris?" "The report doesn't indicate any of those issues, but the point is..." "The point, Mr. Chen, is that we're discussing a man seeking shelter from freezing temperatures in December." Judge Williams' voice carried a sharper edge now. "What was the temperature that night?" The prosecutor fumbled through his papers. "I don't have that specific information readily available." 23 degrees, Thomas Mitchell said quietly. "Felt colder with the wind." The courtroom fell silent again. 23 degrees. Below freezing. A temperature that could kill a person sleeping outdoors. Judge Williams turned her attention back to the defendant. "Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned 3 deployments. What was your role with the Rangers?" "I was a medic, Your Honor. Combat medic with some additional specialized training." He paused, then added with characteristic military understatement, "I helped take care of people who got hurt." Something inside Judge Williams' chest tightened. A combat medic. Of course he was. The pieces of a puzzle she'd been carrying for 20 years were finally clicking into place. "Can you tell me about your transition back to civilian life after your service ended?" Thomas shifted slightly, and for the first time, some of his military composure cracked. "It's been challenging, Your Honor. I came back with some issues, PTSD, traumatic brain injury from an IED blast during my last deployment. The VA has been helpful when they can be, but the system is overwhelmed. Took me 3 years just to get my disability rating processed." "And your employment since then?" "I worked construction for about 8 years after I got out." "Good, honest work. But the head injuries, they got worse over time. Memory problems, balance issues. Had a fall from scaffolding that injured my back pretty severely. Workers' comp covered the immediate medical bills, but..." He trailed off, unwilling to elaborate on the downward spiral that followed. "What about family? Support system?" Thomas's weathered face tightened. "My wife filed for divorce while I was on my 3rd deployment. Can't say I blame her. She tried to hold things together while I was gone, but military life is hard on families. My parents passed while I was overseas. I've got a sister in Oregon, but she's got her own struggles." The human cost of service laid bare in just a few sentences. Judge Williams had to fight to maintain her professional composure as she processed what she was hearing. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you about something specific, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Her voice was steady, but those who knew her could detect the underlying emotion. During your deployment in Iraq in 2003 to 2004, were you involved in any operations in the Anbar province? The question hung in the air like smoke. Thomas Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly as he searched his memory, decades of experiences in trauma making recall difficult. Yes, Your Honor. Multiple operations throughout the province. Fallujah, Ramadi, smaller forward operating bases. He paused, studying the judge's face with growing curiosity. Might I ask why that's relevant to the charges against me? Judge Williams ignored the question. Do you recall an operation in late October 2003, approximately 15 kilometers southeast of Fallujah? An ambush situation involving a convoy escort mission? The courtroom had grown completely still. Even Prosecutor Chen had stopped shuffling through his papers, sensing that something far beyond the scope of loitering charges was unfolding before them. Thomas Mitchell's posture straightened further, if such a thing were possible. His eyes focused with the intensity of someone accessing memories he'd spent years trying to forget. October 28, 2003, he said slowly. Third convoy that week. We were escorting supply trucks to FOB Liberty when we got hit by a coordinated ambush. Insurgents had positioned themselves in abandoned buildings on both sides of the road. His voice grew quieter. We lost 2 vehicles in the initial RPG strikes. Multiple casualties. And your role in that engagement? I was the lead medic. When the shooting started, I moved between vehicles under fire to reach the wounded. Standard protocol was to establish a casualty collection point and wait for reinforcement, but we had soldiers bleeding out who couldn't wait. Judge Williams leaned forward slightly. Do you remember treating a young lieutenant that day? Someone who'd been hit by shrapnel from an IED. Thomas's eyes widened as specific memories began to surface through the haze of combat trauma. There were several officers wounded that day, Your Honor. I treated multiple casualties, but... He paused, his expression growing more focused. There was a lieutenant, yes. Young kid, maybe 24, 25 years old. Shrapnel had caught him in the abdomen and leg. He was conscious but losing blood fast. Do you remember his name? Names got fuzzy in situations like that, ma'am. When you're trying to keep someone alive, you focus on the wound, not the name tape. Thomas's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. But I remember he kept trying to get back to his radio. Kept saying he needed to coordinate the response for his soldiers. Had to physically restrain him to keep him still while I worked. Judge Williams' hands were trembling openly now. She clasped them together in her lap, fighting to maintain judicial decorum while her personal world shifted beneath her feet. The lieutenant you treated that day, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you remember what happened to him? I stabilized him enough to get him to the medevac bird, Thomas replied. Last I saw him, he was conscious and giving me hell about leaving his soldiers behind. Tough kid. Real leader. His expression darkened. I heard later that he made it through surgery and was evacuated to Germany. Never learned what happened after that. The silence that followed was profound. Judge Williams sat frozen behind the bench, 20 years of wondering finally coming to an end. In the gallery, an elderly man with a veteran's cap had quietly entered and taken a seat, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name. The bailiff noticed him but made no move to question his presence. Your Honor. Prosecutor Chen ventured, clearly confused by the direction the hearing had taken. Should we return to the matter at hand? Judge Williams looked at him as if she'd forgotten he existed. Mr. Chen, I need to take a brief recess. 15 minutes. She turned to the bailiff. Please ensure Mr. Mitchell remains in the courtroom. We'll resume shortly. As she rose from the bench, Judge Williams made eye contact with Thomas Mitchell for the first time since he'd stated his name. The recognition wasn't quite there yet, but she could see him studying her face, trying to place something familiar in features that had changed over 2 decades. All rise, called the bailiff automatically, though most of the courtroom was already on its feet in confusion. Judge Williams walked to her chambers on unsteady legs, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Only then did she allow her professional mask to slip. She sank into her leather chair, pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk, and withdrew a small wooden box that she hadn't opened in months. Inside, carefully preserved, were 2 letters written on military letterhead. Both were addressed to Mom and Dad in neat handwriting that had grown shakier as the weeks progressed. Both were signed Love, Michael. Lieutenant Michael Williams. Her younger brother. The baby of the family who'd joined the army against their parents' wishes, determined to serve his country after September 11th. The young man who'd written home about the Rangers who'd served alongside his unit, especially the medic everyone called Doc who'd saved his life during an ambush outside Fallujah. The medic named Thomas Mitchell. Michael had written about that day in his second-to-last letter home. He described the chaos of the ambush, the terror of being wounded and trapped under fire, and the calm presence of the Ranger medic who'd appeared beside him like an angel. He kept talking to me the whole time he worked, Michael had written. Told me about his hometown in Ohio, asked about my family, kept me focused on staying alive instead of the pain. I know I wouldn't have made it without him. When the helicopter came, he actually had to push me onto the stretcher because I didn't want to leave my soldiers behind. He told me that taking care of myself was the best way to take care of them. 3 weeks later, Michael Williams was killed when his convoy hit another IED. This time, Doc Mitchell wasn't there to save him. Judge Williams had spent years wondering about the medic who'd given her family 3 more weeks with Michael. She tried to track him down through military channels, wanting to thank him, to tell him that those extra weeks had mattered. But the Army's bureaucracy was vast, and Rangers were often reassigned quickly. She'd never found him. Until today. A knock on her chamber door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, quickly wiping her eyes and straightening her robe. Alexander Rossi, her longtime friend and one of the city's most respected attorneys, stepped inside without invitation. They'd known each other since law school, and he was one of the few people who could read her moods accurately. "Patty, what the hell is going on out there?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "I was in the hallway when that homeless veteran stated his name, and you looked like you'd seen a ghost." Judge Williams gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Alex. I need to tell you something, and then I need your help." She explained about Michael, about the letters, about the medic named Thomas Mitchell who'd saved her brother's life in Iraq. As she spoke, Alex's expression grew more serious. "You're certain it's the same man?" he asked when she finished. "Every detail matches. The unit, the date, the location, even the description of what happened." She held up one of Michael's letters. "My brother wrote that Doc Mitchell was from Ohio, mentioned he'd been a construction worker before enlisting. The man in my courtroom mentioned construction work after his service ended." Alex leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "Patty, you know you'll have to recuse yourself from this case. Personal involvement this significant." "I'm not recusing myself," Judge Williams interrupted firmly. "This man saved my brother's life. He's homeless and facing charges for trying not to freeze to death. I'm not going to let him slip through the cracks of a system that's already failed him once. The ethical implications. The ethical implications of turning my back on him are worse than any procedural concerns." Her voice carried the steel that had made her reputation as a tough but fair judge. "Besides, I haven't made any rulings yet. I'm gathering information relevant to sentencing considerations." Alex studied his old friend's face and recognized the determination there. "What do you need from me?" "Pro bono representation for Mr. Mitchell. The best defense attorney I know taking his case immediately." "Patty." "Alex, this man gave my family the gift of 3 more weeks with Michael. 3 weeks to say goodbye, to tell him we loved him, to have the conversations that matter. How do you put a price on that?" Alexander Rossi had built his career on high-profile cases and wealthy clients, but he also had a reputation for taking on worthy causes. And he'd never been able to say no to Patricia Williams. "I'll need to review his case file and interview him properly," he said finally. "Whatever you need. Just make sure he doesn't get lost in the system." A few minutes later, they returned to the courtroom together. The small gallery had filled slightly during the recess. Word had somehow spread that something unusual was happening in courtroom 3B. The elderly veteran in the corner had been joined by two others, all wearing military insignia on their jackets. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Williams returned to the bench. The Honorable Judge Patricia Williams presiding. As the courtroom settled, Alexander Rossi approached the defense table where Thomas Mitchell waited in confusion. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Alexander Rossi. I'd like to represent you in this matter, if you'll have me." Thomas looked up at the impeccably dressed attorney with suspicion. "I can't afford a lawyer like you, sir." "You won't need to. Consider it a professional courtesy." Rossi set his briefcase down and extended his hand. "I understand you served with the 75th Rangers." "Yes, sir. 3 deployments. Then we have something in common. I was Army JAG for 6 years before entering private practice. Different kind of service, but service nonetheless." Judge Williams watched the interaction from the bench, grateful for Alex's smooth handling of the situation. She turned her attention to the prosecutor, who was clearly struggling to understand why such a simple case had attracted such high-powered legal representation. "Mr. Chen, before we proceed further, I'd like to understand the full scope of Mr. Mitchell's situation. Has he been offered assistance in accessing veteran services?" The prosecutor shuffled through his papers again. "I don't believe that information is included in the police reports, Your Honor." "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Williams addressed the defendant directly, "when was the last time you were in contact with Veterans Affairs regarding housing assistance or disability benefits?" Thomas straightened in his chair. "I've been trying to work with the VA for years, Your Honor. My current disability rating is 60%, which provides some monthly compensation, but it's not enough to cover rent in this city. I'm on a waiting list for VA housing, but the wait time is currently estimated at 18 to 24 months. And your medical care? I receive treatment at the VA Medical Center for my PTSD and TBI, but appointments are sometimes weeks apart. Transportation is an issue when you don't have a permanent address." Judge Williams made notes as he spoke, but her mind was racing beyond the immediate legal issues. This was the man who'd saved Michael, reduced to sleeping behind restaurants to avoid freezing to death while waiting for a bureaucracy to process his basic needs. "Mr. Rossi, I assume you'll need time to properly review your client's case and explore all available options?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'd also like to request an evaluation of Mr. Mitchell's current veteran benefit status and explore expedited housing options." "Granted." "Mr. Chen, what is the state's position on bail pending a continuance?" The prosecutor looked uncomfortable. "Given the nature of the charges and the defendant's circumstances, the state has no objection to release on personal recognizance. Mr. Mitchell will be released on his own recognizance with the condition that he check in with Mr. Rossi's office twice weekly and make himself available for any court-ordered evaluations." Judge Williams paused, looking directly at the defendant. "Mr. Mitchell, do you have somewhere safe to stay while your case is pending?" The question hung in the air. Thomas Mitchell's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered with characteristic honesty. "I'll manage, Your Honor. I always do." It was exactly the response she'd expected, and exactly the one that broke her heart. "Court is adjourned until Monday, January 15th, at 2 p.m. Mr. Rossi, please see that your client has access to appropriate temporary accommodations." As the courtroom began to empty, Thomas Mitchell stood slowly, still processing the unexpected turn his morning had taken. The elderly veterans in the gallery approached him, and she could hear fragments of their conversation, questions about his unit, his service, offers of help from men who understood his situation because they'd lived it themselves. Judge Williams remained on the bench longer than usual, watching the scene unfold. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear Michael's voice from that last phone call home, talking about the medic who'd saved his life. "He's the kind of soldier you read about in books, Patty," Michael had said. "The kind who runs toward danger when everyone else is running away." If anything ever happens to me over here, I want you to know that there are people like Doc Mitchell fighting beside me. Real heroes. Now that hero was homeless and facing jail time for trying to survive winter on the streets. But not if she could help it. As the courtroom finally emptied, Judge Williams gathered her files and headed back to her chambers. She had phone calls to make, favors to call in, and a debt to repay that was 20 years overdue. The story of Thomas Joseph Mitchell, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment, was far from over. 3 days passed before Judge Williams could arrange what she needed. 3 days during which Thomas Mitchell stayed at a modest hotel paid for by Alexander Rossi's firm. 3 days during which she made phone calls that reached into the highest levels of the Veterans Administration and the Department of Defense. On Friday morning, an hour before court was scheduled to reconvene, Judge Williams sat in her chambers reviewing a file that had arrived by courier the night before. The official military records of Staff Sergeant Thomas Joseph Mitchell painted a picture of heroism that even exceeded what her brother had described in his letters. 3 bronze stars. 2 Purple Hearts. A Silver Star for gallantry in action. Commendations that read like scenes from a war movie, except every word was documented fact. The man facing minor charges in her courtroom had saved dozens of lives during his 3 deployments, including her brother's. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Alexander Rossi entered, followed by a distinguished man in military dress uniform. "Judge Williams, I'd like you to meet Colonel David Harrison, U.S. Army Special Operations Command." The colonel stepped forward with crisp military bearing. "Your Honor, I understand you've been inquiring about Staff Sergeant Mitchell's service record." "I have, Colonel. What I've learned is quite remarkable." "It's more remarkable than you know, ma'am. The file you received contains only the declassified portions of Sergeant Mitchell's record. There are several operations that remain classified, but I can tell you that his actions in Iraq saved significantly more lives than the official record indicates." Judge Williams gestured for both men to sit. "Colonel, what happened to Sergeant Mitchell after his discharge? How does a decorated war hero end up homeless?" The colonel's expression grew grim. "Unfortunately, Judge Williams, it's a story we've seen too often. Sergeant Mitchell's traumatic brain injury was more severe than initially diagnosed. The symptoms worsened over time: memory issues, cognitive problems, difficulty processing complex information. By the time the VA properly evaluated his condition, he'd already lost his job, his home, and his support system. And his disability rating? Should have been 100% from the beginning. The paperwork was mishandled, lost in bureaucratic transfers. We've been trying to locate veterans like Sergeant Mitchell as part of a systematic review, but many slip through the cracks." The colonel paused. "When Mr. Rossi contacted us, we fast-tracked his case review." Alexander Rossi leaned forward. "Judge, there's something else. Colonel Harrison has brought some people who want to be here when court reconvenes." "What kind of people?" "Soldiers whose lives Thomas Mitchell saved. They've been traveling since Tuesday night to be here today." An hour later, courtroom 3B was fuller than it had been for any municipal hearing in recent memory. The gallery was packed with men and women in military dress uniforms, others in civilian clothes wearing veteran organization pins and patches. Word had somehow spread through military networks that Doc Mitchell, the legendary Ranger medic, had been found. Among them sat James Rodriguez, now a major, who'd been a young private when Thomas Mitchell had dragged him to safety during a firefight in Afghanistan. Saracen, no relation to the prosecutor, a former Army captain whose convoy Thomas had helped defend during a 3-hour siege in Iraq. Michael Torres, who'd lost his left leg to an IED but kept his life because Doc Mitchell had applied a tourniquet under fire and refused to leave him behind. In the front row sat an elderly couple, Robert and Helen Williams, Judge Williams' parents, who'd driven 4 hours that morning after receiving a call from their daughter. Next to them was a woman in her 40s with tears already forming in her eyes, Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Mitchell, Thomas's estranged sister who'd flown in from Oregon the night before. Thomas Mitchell entered the courtroom in handcuffs again, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 Veterans Administration counselors accompanied him, along with Alexander Rossi and a military liaison officer. As he walked toward the defendant's table, a low murmur rippled through the packed gallery. These were people who knew his reputation, who'd heard stories of Doc Mitchell's heroism passed down through military units like legends. "All rise," called the bailiff. The Honorable Judge Patricia Williams presiding. As Judge Williams took her seat, she scanned the crowded courtroom. Her eyes found her parents in the front row, then moved to the dozens of service members who'd come to honor a man they'd never forgotten. Finally, her gaze settled on Thomas Mitchell, who looked overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. "Please be seated," she said, though her voice carried a different quality than usual, softer, more personal. "Before we proceed with the continuation of this case, I need to address something that has come to light since our last hearing." She paused, composing herself for what she was about to reveal. "Mr. Mitchell, 3 days ago you testified about an operation in Iraq in October 2003, during which you treated multiple casualties including a young lieutenant who'd been wounded by shrapnel." Thomas nodded carefully. "Yes, Your Honor. That lieutenant's name was Michael Williams. He was my brother." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by absolute silence. Thomas Mitchell's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening slightly as the implications sank in. "Your Honor, he began, but Judge Williams raised her hand gently. "Please, let me finish." Her voice was steady, but those in the front row could see her hands trembling slightly. "My brother wrote to our family about that day. He described the medic who saved his life, who kept him conscious and talking while treating his wounds under fire. He wrote about a soldier he called Doc Mitchell, who pushed him onto the evacuation helicopter because Michael didn't want to leave his soldiers behind." The silence in the courtroom was profound. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the moment unfolding before them. "Michael lived for 3 more weeks because of what you did that day," Judge Williams continued, her professional composure beginning to crack. 3 weeks that allowed our family to tell him we loved him one more time. 3 weeks that gave us memories we treasure to this day." Thomas Mitchell sat frozen, 20 years of buried memories flooding back. His weathered face contorted with emotion as he remembered the young lieutenant who'd fought him every step of the way to the medevac helicopter. "Lieutenant Williams," he whispered, the name coming back to him with sudden clarity. He kept trying to get back to his radio. Kept saying he needed to take care of his soldiers. "That was Michael," Judge Williams said, tears now flowing freely down her face. "Always putting others first, just like the medic who saved him." From the gallery, Major Rodriguez stood up, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, if I may, Staff Sergeant Mitchell saved my life too. Afghanistan, 2007. I was 19 years old and bleeding out from an IED blast. Doc Mitchell stayed with me for 4 hours under intermittent fire, keeping me alive until the medevac could reach us." As if a dam had broken, other voices began to speak from the gallery. "He pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah, called Saracen. Went back twice to get my gunner and driver." "Ramadi, 2004, said another voice. "Doc Mitchell treated 14 wounded soldiers during a 12-hour firefight. Never left his post, never stopped working." "Mosul, 2009. He ran across a courtyard under sniper fire to reach wounded civilians, Iraqi kids who'd been caught in crossfire." One by one, soldiers stood to testify to Thomas Mitchell's heroism. Each story was a thread in a tapestry of service that painted a picture of a man who'd made saving lives his mission, regardless of personal risk. Thomas Mitchell listened to their testimonies with growing amazement. He'd spent years believing his service didn't matter, that the system had forgotten him and moved on. Now he was hearing that these soldiers, many of whom had gone on to successful military careers, had never forgotten Doc Mitchell. Judge Williams called for order as the testimonies threatened to overwhelm the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, while I appreciate your desire to honor Sergeant Mitchell, we must maintain proper court procedure." She turned her attention back to the defendant. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to understand something. For 20 years, I've wondered about the medic who saved my brother's life. I tried to find you after Michael's funeral, but military bureaucracy made that impossible. I never imagined that fate would bring you into my courtroom under these circumstances. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion, I never knew Lieutenant Williams had a sister. He talked about his family sometimes while I was treating him, but... He paused, struggling with the weight of memory and revelation. He was a good officer. A brave man. I'm sorry for your loss. You gave us the gift of time with him, Sergeant Mitchell. Time we never would have had without your courage. Prosecutor Chen, who had remained silent throughout the extraordinary testimony, finally stood up. Your Honor, while these revelations are certainly moving, I'm not sure how they relate to the charges before this court. Judge Williams fixed him with a stare that could have frozen water. Mr. Chen, they relate because they demonstrate the character of the man standing before us. A man who has given everything in service to his country and received very little in return. She gestured to Colonel Harrison, who stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, if I may address the court? Proceed, Colonel. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's military records have been under review as part of a Veterans Administration initiative to correct historical oversights. His disability rating has been upgraded to 100%, retroactive to his discharge date. This entitles him to significant back pay, full medical benefits, and priority access to VA housing. A murmur of approval swept through the gallery. But Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. Additionally, based on newly declassified information about Sergeant Mitchell's actions during multiple operations, the Department of Defense is upgrading his Silver Star to the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. The courtroom erupted in applause. Veterans stood and began to salute, while civilians clapped and cheered. Thomas Mitchell sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by recognition that was decades overdue. Judge Williams banged her gavel for order, though she was smiling through her tears. Ladies and gentlemen, please. When the courtroom finally settled, she addressed the prosecutor directly. Mr. Chen, in light of everything we've heard today, what is the state's recommendation regarding the charges against Sergeant Mitchell? The young prosecutor looked around the courtroom, at the dozens of service members, at the elderly parents in the front row, at the judge whose professional mask had given way to raw human emotion. Whatever ambitions he'd had for building a tough reputation suddenly seemed petty and small. Your Honor, he said quietly, the state moves to dismiss all charges with prejudice. The courtroom exploded again, this time with sustained applause and cheers. Veterans whistled and shouted. Some were openly crying. Alexander Rossi gripped his client's shoulder as Thomas Mitchell buried his face in his hands, 20 years of carrying the weight of being forgotten finally lifting from his shoulders. If this story is touching your heart like it's touching mine, please subscribe to hear more stories about the heroes among us. Comment below with hero if you think this veteran deserves justice. Let's see how many people believe in honoring our service members. Judge Williams waited for the celebration to subside before speaking again. Motion granted. All charges against Staff Sergeant Thomas Joseph Mitchell are hereby dismissed with prejudice. She brought down her gavel with finality. Furthermore, this court commends Sergeant Mitchell for his extraordinary service to our nation and apologizes for the failures of the system he served so faithfully. But she wasn't finished. Judge Williams stood up behind the bench, removing her judicial robe for the first time in her career during active court proceedings. Underneath, she wore a simple black dress with a small pin on the lapel, her brother's military insignia. Sergeant Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom, my brother wrote something in his last letter home that I want to share with you. She pulled out a worn piece of paper from her pocket, Michael's final letter, which she'd brought with her that morning. He wrote, Doc Mitchell told me something while he was treating my wounds. He said that no soldier fights alone, that we're all connected by something bigger than ourselves. He said that taking care of each other is the most important mission any of us will ever have. Michael wrote that he wanted to be the kind of officer that Doc Mitchell was, someone who never leaves a fallen comrade behind. Thomas Mitchell was crying openly now, the emotional walls he'd built over decades of trauma and neglect finally crumbling. Today, Judge Williams continued, this community is honoring that principle. We're not leaving you behind anymore, Sergeant Mitchell. From the back of the courtroom, a voice called out, attention. Every service member in the gallery snapped to attention and saluted. The gesture spread throughout the room until everyone, veterans, civilians, court personnel, even Prosecutor Chin, was standing in respect for the man who'd saved so many lives and asked for nothing in return. Thomas Mitchell stood slowly, his body straightened by muscle memory and renewed pride. For the first time in years, he returned their salute with the precision of the soldier he'd always been. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted the initial revelations. This was a moment of pure respect, recognition, and healing. In that courtroom, the gap between a hero's service and society's gratitude was finally bridged. As the formal salute concluded, Jennifer Mitchell pushed through the crowd to reach her brother. They hadn't spoken in over 5 years, their relationship another casualty of Thomas's struggles with PTSD and the family's inability to understand what he was going through. Tommy, she said, using the childhood nickname she hadn't spoken in decades. I'm so sorry. I should have tried harder to find you, to help you. Thomas embraced his sister, his voice thick with emotion. Jenny, I was lost for a long time. I didn't know how to ask for help. You don't have to ask anymore, she replied. We're family. We take care of each other. The Williams parents approached next. Robert Williams, now in his 70s, extended his hand to Thomas. Sergeant Mitchell, my wife and I can never adequately thank you for what you did for Michael. But we want you to know that you'll always be part of our family. Helen Williams, tears streaming down her face, simply hugged the man who'd given her 3 more weeks with her son. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Judge Williams found herself alone with Thomas Mitchell and Alexander Rossi. The formal proceedings were over, but the personal conversation was just beginning. Sergeant Mitchell, she said quietly, I have a favor to ask. Anything, Your Honor. Ma'am. After what you've done today. Please, call me Patricia. We're not in formal session anymore. She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say. I'd like you to tell me about Michael's last day. About what he was like as a soldier, as a man. The family never got that closure from the military. Thomas nodded slowly. He was everything you'd want in an officer, ma'am. Patricia. He cared about his soldiers more than himself. During that firefight, even with shrapnel in his abdomen, he was trying to coordinate the response to protect his men. He asked about every wounded soldier by name before he'd let me put him on that helicopter. That sounds like Michael. He talked about home while I was treating him. Mentioned his sister who was in law school, said she was going to change the world by fighting for justice. Thomas managed a small smile. Guess he was right about that. Patricia Williams wiped her eyes. He would have been so proud to know his sister became a judge. And he would have been heartbroken to know that the medic who saved his life was living on the streets. That's over now, Alexander Rossi interjected gently. The VA housing coordinator is expecting you Monday morning, Thomas. Full benefits, back pay, comprehensive medical care. And I have some colleagues who work specifically with veteran employment programs. Thomas shook his head in amazement. 3 days ago, I was sleeping behind a restaurant. Today. He gestured around the empty courtroom. I still can't believe this is real. It's real, Patricia assured him. And it's long overdue. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Thomas turned back to the judge one final time. Patricia, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Michael would have been proud of the man I became? Even with all the struggles, all the years I was lost? Patricia Williams considered the question carefully before answering. Thomas, my brother wrote that you are the kind of soldier who runs toward danger when everyone else runs away. Today, listening to all those testimonies, I realized something. You never stopped being that soldier. Even when you were homeless, even when the system failed you, you maintained your dignity and your integrity. You could have become bitter, angry, destructive. Instead, You remain the man who helped others even when no one was helping you. She paused, looking around the courtroom where so much had been healed. Michael always said that true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear. You've been showing that kind of courage every day for 20 years, just by surviving, by maintaining your humanity in circumstances that would have broken most people. Yes, Thomas. I believe Michael would be incredibly proud of the man you became. 1 month later, Thomas Mitchell stood in front of a mirror in his new apartment, a modest but comfortable one-bedroom unit in a VA housing complex. The walls were no longer bare, they displayed his military decorations in a place of honor, alongside photographs from the courtroom ceremony and letters from the soldiers whose lives he'd saved. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Patricia Williams stood in the hallway, holding a small wrapped package. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit," she said. "Not at all. Please, come in." They sat in his small living room, and Patricia handed him the package. "I wanted to give you something." Thomas unwrapped it carefully, revealing a framed photograph of a young man in military dress uniform, Lieutenant Michael Williams at his commissioning ceremony. "I wanted you to have this," Patricia said softly. "So you could remember him as he was, young, proud, ready to serve his country, just like the medic who saved his life." Thomas studied the photograph, seeing in Michael's face the same determination and integrity that had impressed him during that chaotic day in Iraq. "There's something else," Patricia continued. She handed him an envelope with his name written in careful script. "This is a letter Michael never got to send. I found it in his personal effects after he died. It's addressed to Doc Mitchell, U.S. Army Rangers." With trembling hands, Thomas opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Michael's handwriting was neat and precise. "Doc, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I had to try. I wanted to thank you for what you did during the ambush last month. Not just for treating my wounds, but for the way you treated me like a person, not just another casualty. When I was lying there bleeding and scared, you kept me talking about home, about my family, about the things that matter. You reminded me that I had reasons to fight, reasons to live. That meant more than any medical treatment could have. I also want you to know that your example has changed how I lead my soldiers. I've learned, Ramu, that taking care of people is the most important mission any of us have. I try to approach every decision by asking myself what Doc Mitchell would do. If something happens to me over here, I want my family to know about soldiers like you. I want them to know that there are real heroes fighting alongside me, people who embody the best of what it means to serve. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for showing me what it means to be a soldier. Respectfully, Lieutenant Michael Williams." Thomas read the letter twice before looking up at Patricia. "He never got to send this. He was killed the day after he wrote it. But I think he'd want you to know that his last thoughts were about the impact you'd had on him as a soldier and as a man." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people connected by loss and gratitude, by the enduring bonds formed in moments of crisis and courage. "Patricia," Thomas said finally, "I've been thinking about something. All those soldiers who came to the courthouse, they've moved on with their lives, built careers, raised families. They didn't forget, but they didn't need to carry the weight of what happened overseas. And you did? I carried it because I thought that was my job. I thought if I forgot, if I moved on, then the soldiers who didn't make it home would be forgotten too." He gestured to the photograph of Michael. "But listening to Michael's letter, seeing how my actions influenced him as a leader, maybe the best way to honor the fallen isn't to carry guilt, but to live fully." Patricia smiled. "I think Michael would agree with that." As she prepared to leave, Patricia placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You know, this whole experience has changed how I approach my work. I've started a special Veterans Court program, working with the VA to identify service members who need help before they end up facing charges. We're calling it the Mitchell Protocol." Thomas looked surprised. "You named it after me?" "After you and Michael both. It's about making sure no veteran is forgotten, and no family left wondering about their hero." Patricia drove home reflecting on Thomas Mitchell's journey. What began as a simple case had become a story of justice and healing. Soon Thomas started work at a veterans counseling center, guiding others who faced the same struggles. Speaking to homeless veterans, he reminded them their sacrifices mattered. True courage is doing what's right despite fear. You've all shown that courage by surviving. One young Marine, Maria Santos, found hope in his story and joined Judge Williams' program. From courtroom recognition to community action, Thomas found purpose again, helping veterans like himself. The silence that once filled the courtroom became a symbol, not just one judge recognizing one man, but a community choosing gratitude over neglect. Sometimes the most powerful sound is silence, the moment when recognition replaces indifference, when gratitude replaces neglect, and when a hero's name is finally spoken with the respect it has always deserved.